The old man opened his cabin door expecting the storm. What he got instead were two elderly strangers, soaking wet, shaking so hard their teeth clicked like Morse code, clutching a metal box against their chests like it was the only solid thing left in their world. He didn't know them, didn't know their names, didn't know what they were running from. But Ranger did. The dog didn't growl at the couple. He turned toward the tree line, ears flat, body low, and stared into the dark like something out there was already staring back. If you've never seen a trained dog go still like that, you don't know what fear looks like. But Elias Boone did, and he knew tonight was going to be a long one. Subscribe now and hit that bell, because this story is just getting started. Drop your city and country in the comments. Let's see how far this goes. The snow had been falling since noon, and by 7 it had turned vicious. Not the clean postcard kind of snow that people from cities think about when they imagine Colorado mountains. This was the other kind, horizontal, wind-driven, sharp as ground glass against exposed skin. The kind that killed cars on switchbacks and buried road markers under 2 feet of white before anyone noticed they were gone. The kind that made Frost Ridge feel like the last place on Earth, which was more or less why Elias Boone had moved there. He was 40 years old and looked it, not in a worn-down way, but in the way that certain tools look after long use. Functional, deliberate. The creases around his eyes came from squinting into sun and wind, not from smiling. His hands were the kind of hands that knew how to do things, calloused across the knuckles, steady even when the rest of him wasn't. He'd been out of the Larimer County Search and Rescue Unit for 2 years now, after a knee injury on a crevasse extraction had ended the argument about whether he should retire. The mountain had made the decision for him. He didn't miss the job, exactly. He missed the clarity of it. Tonight he was at his workbench, which occupied the north wall of the main room under a rack of hand tools that hung in descending size like a museum exhibit. 3 emergency radio units were laid out in front of him, a Motorola APX he was modifying for extended range, an older Kenwood he was stripping for parts, and a handheld Baofeng he'd found at a swap meet and was nursing back to life out of stubbornness. The cabin smelled like solder and pine resin and the venison stew he'd let go cold on the back burner an hour ago. Ranger was asleep by the wood stove, or appeared to be. The German Shepherd was 11 years old, which was deep middle age for a working dog, and one ear had a notch in it from a barbed wire incident during a search operation near Red Feather Lakes 4 years back. He'd been Elias's partner for almost a decade, first in the field and then in retirement, and he communicated in the economical language of trained animals. A glance meant pay attention. A shift of weight meant something changed, and stillness, true, deliberate stillness, meant stop what you're doing right now. Elias was soldering a connector onto the Baofeng's antenna lead when Ranger's head came up. Not fast, not alarmed, just up, ears forward. Elias set the soldering iron in its stand and waited. The wind hit the cabin in irregular gusts that rattled the storm shutters and made the stovepipe moan in a low, tuneless note. Snow ticked against the windows like thrown gravel. He'd been listening to these sounds for 2 winters and could read them the way other people read weather apps. Nothing in the wind sounded like anything other than wind. Then the knock came. 2 impacts, heavy and close together, like someone who didn't have the strength left to do it properly. Ranger was already on his feet, not barking, just standing with his weight forward, watching the door. Elias crossed the room and lifted the peephole cover he'd installed after moving in, an old habit from years of working in areas where you didn't just open doors in the dark. The fisheye lens showed him the narrow covered porch, and in the amber spillover of the porch light, 2 figures stood against the railing. An old man in a soaked wool coat, one hand braced on the railing, the other around the waist of an old woman who had her face turned into his shoulder. She was holding something under her coat with both arms, pressed against her chest. Elias unlatched the deadbolt. The cold came in with them, a wall of it, and both of the old people made involuntary sounds, relief and distress tangled together, as the warmth of the cabin hit their faces. The woman's lips had gone bluish. The man was shaking so hard his coat made a sound against the door frame. "Come in," Elias said, which was unnecessary because he was already stepping aside and reaching for the man's arm. Watch the step. He got them to the couch by the wood stove, which was the warmest spot in the room. Ranger retreated to the far side of his sleeping spot and sat, watching, his dark eyes moving between the 2 strangers with the careful attention he'd once given to accident scenes. The old woman still hadn't let go of whatever she was holding. Your car? Elias asked. He'd pulled 2 wool blankets from the chest by the window and draped one over each of them. The man's hands were white at the knuckles, red at the fingertips. Bad. Not frostbitten yet, but close. On the road, the old man managed. Maybe. Mile back. Maybe more. We walked. A mile in this storm. At their age. Elias looked at them and revised his initial read upward. They were older than he'd first thought. Late 70s, maybe 80. The man had a careful, deliberate way of holding himself that suggested someone who'd spent a lifetime doing physical work and was now paying the tab for it. The woman was smaller, and her stillness wasn't calm. It was the stillness of someone managing pain. Eleanor, the man said quietly, how are your feet? Fine, she said, in a tone that meant, don't ask me that again right now. I need to get your boots off, Elias said to her. And yours. He looked at the man. What's your name? Walter. Walter Hale. He gestured toward the woman. My wife. Eleanor. Elias Boone. He knelt and started unlacing Eleanor's boot. Her socks were soaked through. He kept his voice flat, practical. The voice he'd used with accident victims for 15 years, the one that meant, I'm handling this. You don't have to panic. How long were you in the car before you started walking? Maybe 30 minutes, Walter said. We tried to call... He stopped. Your phones? The old man's jaw tightened. They weren't working. Elias glanced up from the boot. Service up here is bad, but not... They weren't working, Walter said again, and the way he said it was different from the first time. More deliberate. Like he was making sure Elias heard the distinction. Elias set Eleanor's boot aside and looked at her feet. Cold, pale, but sensation returning. She winced when he pressed 2 fingers gently against her arch. Good. Pain meant blood flow. I've got a landline, Elias said. I'll call the county road crew and get them up here. You two need to get warm and then I can run you down to... No, Eleanor said. He looked up at her. She was watching him with dark, steady eyes, and whatever vulnerability she'd had when she'd come through the door was receding like tide water. She had the metal box in her lap now. He could see it clearly. Stainless or aluminum, the kind you'd find in a lawyer's filing room. Latched, but not padlocked. No calls, she said. Elias sat back on his heels. Mrs. Hale. Eleanor. She said it firmly. And I heard you. No calls yet, please. She glanced at Walter, then back at Elias. Give us 10 minutes to explain. Then you can decide. Walter was staring at the floor. Whatever was in the box, he didn't look like a man who wanted to talk about it. He looked like a man who was very, very tired and had been tired for a long time. Elias moved to the kitchen. He came back with 2 mugs of hot water with instant broth, not elegant, but fast and warm, and set them on the low table in front of the couch. He pulled the straight-back chair from the workbench and sat on it backwards, arms across the top rail. 10 minutes, he said. Eleanor Hale told him in the direct, organized way of someone who'd had to explain a complicated situation more than once and had gotten better at it each time. She and Walter had owned the Hale family ranch outside Durango for 41 years. 460 acres of grazing land, a working well, a small cattle operation they'd scaled back over the past decade as their knees and backs had registered their objections. The property had been in the Hale family longer than that. Walter's father had bought the original parcel in 1962, added to it twice, and left it to Walter in a will that was uncomplicated and clean. Their son, Nathan, and daughter, Caroline, had been making noises for 3 years about the ranch. Helpful noises, initially. They'd offered to take over operations, manage the finances, consolidate accounts. Walter and Eleanor had agreed to some of it. They weren't young, and the paperwork of running even a small agricultural operation had become genuinely exhausting. What they hadn't agreed to was what came next. 2 months ago, Eleanor said, I found documents in Nathan's briefcase. He'd left it at the house when he was visiting. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a pen. She paused. They were transfer papers. For the property. Already notarized. Elias didn't say anything. Our signatures were on them, Walter said quietly. We didn't sign anything. The notary stamp was real, Eleanor continued. Different notary from the one we use, but real. Nathan had found someone. She touched the box in her lap. I took photographs of every page. I put the originals back and I didn't say anything for 2 weeks while I figured out what to do. Then I called a lawyer in Denver, not someone Nathan knew, and she told me to gather everything I could and get it to her. That was yesterday, Walter said. We told Nathan we were going to visit an old friend in Grand Junction. We drove north instead. She looked at the window. Outside, the wind made a sound like a long exhalation. He must have, I don't know, tracked the car somehow, or had someone watching the house. Elias was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the box. The documents are in there? Photographs of everything, and the originals of their bank statements showing the accounts they intended to route the property proceeds through. She held his gaze. It's enough. Margaret, the lawyer, she said it's enough. You need to get it to her. We need to survive the night first, Eleanor said, with a flatness that wasn't resignation. It was precision. She'd assessed the situation and arrived at the correct order of priorities. Elias looked at Ranger. The dog was still sitting where he'd been, but his posture had changed in the last few minutes. He was angled slightly toward the east wall, which faced the tree line. His nostrils were moving. The stew on the back burner had gone cold. The soldering iron had clicked off on its timer. The cabin felt very quiet in the way that spaces feel quiet when the person in them is paying close attention to something outside. How many? Elias asked. Walter frowned. How many people? With Nathan. Eleanor and Walter exchanged a look. We saw 2 vehicles, Walter said slowly. When they followed us onto the highway from Durango, a black pickup and a gray SUV. So, at least 2 drivers, probably more. Nathan doesn't get his hands dirty. Elias nodded once and stood up. He went to the east window without turning the lights off. An old field habit, don't silhouette yourself against illumination, and looked through the narrow gap in the storm shutter. The tree line was maybe 40 yards from the cabin at its nearest point. He couldn't see anything. In a blizzard at night, that meant precisely nothing. He crossed to the workbench and picked up the Motorola. The modification he'd been doing all evening, the range extension, wasn't finished. He ran a quick check anyway. Static. Clean static, which would have been normal. He switched to the emergency frequencies, all 3 of them. Static on all 3. He stood very still for a moment, radio in hand. Static on emergency frequencies wasn't normal. The county repeater on Elk Ridge ran continuous even in bad weather. There was a reason for that. It was the lifeline for exactly the situation he was currently in. He switched the unit off and back on. Ran the scan again. Nothing. Mr. Boone? Eleanor said. Elias. He turned around. His face was neutral, which required some effort. How long have you had those phones that weren't working? Walter thought about it. Since before we got in the car at the gas station, 45 minutes south of here, maybe an hour. Elias set the radio down. 45 minutes south of here was a very specific number. It meant that whatever was interfering with signals hadn't started when the car broke down. It had started earlier. It had been running during their drive, and it was still running now. You didn't jam emergency radio frequencies with a phone app. You needed hardware for that. Dedicated hardware, which was not cheap and not legal, and suggested that whoever was out in those trees had planned this more carefully than a family dispute over an inheritance usually got planned. Elias pulled his parka off the hook by the door. He checked the pockets, flashlight, folding knife, the small emergency kit he kept there out of habit, and then left the parka on the hook and went to the back room instead. When he came back, he was carrying a steel-framed first aid bag and a short wooden dowel he'd cut from a broom handle, which he used to bar the sliding window latch in the bathroom, a low-tech fix for a window that didn't lock properly. He'd been meaning to replace the latch for a year. Tonight he was glad he hadn't. He wedged the dowel in place. Then he went room to room, 4 rooms total, including the bathroom, and checked every point of entry with the systematic, unhurried attention of someone who had spent a significant portion of his professional life figuring out how people got into and out of places they weren't supposed to be. Walter was watching him from the couch. "You're not just a mountain recluse," the old man said. Elias tested the latch on the kitchen window. Solid. "I was SAR for 15 years, search and rescue." He moved to the back door. "You learn how structures work when you've had to get into enough of them. Search and rescue doesn't teach you how to check a building for intruders." Elias glanced back at him. "No. The Army did." Walter nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've filed something away. Eleanor hadn't moved from the couch, but she'd straightened up, and the blanket had slipped off one shoulder. She was watching Ranger, who had moved to the center of the room and was standing there with his muzzle slightly lifted, reading the air. "What does he smell?" she asked. "Diesel fuel," Elias said. "Someone's been running a vehicle out there, not moving, idling, possibly two vehicles." He came back to the main room. "There are at least two people in the trees on the east side of this property, possibly more on the other sides. I can't reach anyone on radio, which means they have a jammer running somewhere within about a quarter mile. You can't jam from farther than that without commercial-grade equipment." He said it all in the same tone he'd used to explain a weather pattern. Eleanor listened in the same spirit. "What do we do?" Walter asked. "First, you stay calm, both of you." He pulled the chair back out and sat on it. "They haven't made a move yet, which means they're not in a hurry. Probably waiting to see if you call for help, realize you can't, and come outside on your own." He thought for a moment. "Nathan doesn't know you came here. He followed you to the mountain, but he doesn't know whose cabin this is or who I am." "That's good," Eleanor said. "That's something." He looked at Ranger. "It's not good yet." The dog turned his head and looked at Elias directly, and for a moment the room was very quiet except for the wind and the soft, rhythmic sound of the fire settling in the wood stove. Then Ranger's head swung back toward the east wall, and his ears went flat. Ranger held that position for 3 full seconds, ears pinned, muzzle angled toward the east wall, not a muscle moving, and then he exhaled through his nose and sat down. Not relaxed, just downgraded. Whatever had spiked his attention had either moved or gone still. Elias didn't move either. He stood near the workbench with his hand resting on the Motorola, not gripping it, just resting, and he watched the dog and listened to the wind work itself against the cabin's north face. The stovepipe had taken up a lower note in the last 10 minutes, which meant the temperature outside had dropped again. He guessed it was somewhere around 14 degrees out there now, maybe 12. In a blizzard with wind chill factored in, that translated to conditions that would kill an unprepared person in under 2 hours, which meant whoever was sitting in those vehicles among the trees had a timeline whether they liked it or not. "They'll make a move soon," Elias said. He wasn't talking to Walter or Eleanor specifically, more like thinking out loud, which was an old habit from field operations when talking through a situation helped him hear the gaps in his own logic. "Cold does that. You can plan to be patient, but the cold makes the decision eventually." Walter had his mug in both hands and was watching Elias the way you watched a mechanic work on your car, trying to read whether the news was going to be bad or very bad. "You keep saying they, Walter said, like you're certain there's more than one." "Ranger told me. He hit 2 separate scent points on the east wall sweep, different vectors, a few minutes apart." He glanced at the dog. "He's not perfect, but he's been right more times than I can count." Eleanor was pulling her second sock back on, the dry pair Elias had dug out of his gear bin, 2 sizes too large. She did it with the methodical focus of someone who understood that functional feet were a tactical asset tonight, not a comfort issue. "Nathan wouldn't come himself," she said. "Not to do something like this. He'd have someone with him, someone he pays." "How does Nathan make his living?" Elias asked. "Real estate development. He buys distressed properties, cleans them up, resells or leases." Her voice had a careful, neutral quality when she said it, the kind of neutrality that takes practice. "He's good at it. He's also very good at finding people who will do things he doesn't want associated with his name." Walter made a small sound in his throat. Not quite agreement, not quite disgust. Something in between. "The ranch," Elias said. "What's it worth?" Walter looked at him. "To us, or to someone who wants to sell it?" "Market." "Somewhere between 2.8 and 3.2 million, Eleanor said. "Depending on water rights, which are attached to the deed. Nathan found a buyer. Developer out of Phoenix who wants to put a resort property on the grazing land." She set her foot down and looked up. "The buyer is already under verbal contract. Nathan has been operating as if the transfer is complete." $3 million. In Elias's experience, and he had more experience than most people assumed with the ways that money warped family relationships, $3 million was the number at which certain people stopped feeling like human beings and started feeling like obstacles. He filed that and moved on. "I need to check the south and west sides," he said. "I'm going to go through the crawl space access in the back room. It runs under the full floor length, I can get eyes on both exterior walls from the foundation vents without going outside. He looked at them both. While I'm doing that, don't turn on any lights I haven't already got on. Don't look out any windows. Don't use the landline. I thought the landline was our option, Walter said. It was, but if they've got a jammer for radio frequencies, they might have a line tap as well. A call out would tell them, we know something's wrong. Right now, our best asset is that they don't know what they walked into. He pulled on a canvas work shirt over his flannel and started for the back room. Don't open the door for any reason. What if someone knocks? Eleanor asked. He stopped. Nobody's going to knock politely. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. The crawl space was 42 inches of clearance, concrete footings, and insulation batting that shed fiberglass particles into the air whenever he brushed against it. He'd been down here twice since buying the cabin, once to fix a pipe and once to run an electrical conduit, and he'd never enjoyed it either time. He moved on his forearms and knees with a headlamp strapped to his forehead and the Motorola clipped to his belt, its scan function running on mute, the signal indicator giving him nothing but flat noise on every emergency channel. He stopped at the south foundation vent, a louvered rectangle 4 inches high and 14 wide, designed to prevent moisture buildup under the floor. Through it, angled upward, he could see the south approach to the cabin, the wood shed, the propane tank enclosure, the curved track of the driveway that vanished into the dark. Nothing moving. The snow was coming in from the northwest, which meant the south side was in partial lee. The drifting was lighter there, and he could make out the ground surface, undisturbed, no tracks, no compression marks in the snow that would indicate someone crouching or standing. He moved to the west vent. It took him 4 minutes of careful crawling to get there without making noise against the floorboards above. West side showed him the access road for the first 100 yards before it curved behind the ridgeline. 2 ruts of packed snow where he'd driven the truck 2 days ago, his tracks, already half filled. And 30 yards off the road, just inside the tree line, a dark mass that didn't fit the geometry of the pines around it. He held still and watched it. The headlamp was off. He didn't need it now and didn't want the light leaking through the vent slats. The dark mass was a vehicle. He could see the boxy roofline, the slight elevation of a truck cab. It wasn't running, no exhaust plume, but it also wasn't buried under snow accumulation the way an abandoned vehicle would be. Someone had parked it recently and turned it off. So there were at least 2. One on the east with a running engine, which he'd read from the diesel scent, and one on the west, engine off, which suggested a different role. Observation, maybe. Or blocking the road. He thought about what that implied. If you were Nathan Hale and you'd tracked 2 elderly people to a stranger's cabin on a blizzard night, your play depended on what you wanted. If you just wanted them not to reach Denver, you could wait out the storm. The roads wouldn't clear until morning at the earliest. If you wanted the box, the documents, you needed them to come out voluntarily or you needed to go in. The cold and the blocked road made the waiting game favor Nathan. He had vehicles with heat. Elias had a cabin with a finite wood supply and no working communications. Elias backed away from the west vent and started the slow crawl toward the access hatch. He was most of the way there when the Motorola's signal indicator pulsed. He stopped, pulled the unit from his belt, watched the indicator. Nothing. Then, a flicker. Half a bar on channel 7, which was the State Emergency Management secondary relay. There and gone in under a second. He held the unit and waited, face flat against the cold concrete, listening to snow tick against the foundation. The flicker came again, same channel, same duration. The jammer wasn't perfect, or it was running on a battery that was starting to cycle. Either way, there were holes in the interference, brief ones, probably irregular, and a hole was all you needed if you had the right equipment and knew what you were doing. The Motorola in his hand was not the right equipment. The range modification he'd been working on all evening, the one sitting half-finished on his workbench, would have given him a fighting chance of squeezing a transmission through a gap in the jamming. As it stood, the stock unit didn't have the output power to punch through cleanly. He needed to finish the modification. He needed to do it without drawing attention to what he was doing. He went back through the hatch and into the back room and spent 30 seconds brushing fiberglass particles off his shirt before going back out to the main room. Walter and Eleanor were exactly where he'd left them. Eleanor had moved the document box from her lap to the space between herself and the armrest. which was a small thing that told him she was thinking more clearly, less holding on, more positioning. "Two vehicles confirmed," Elias said quietly. "East side is running hot, which means a driver and possibly a passenger. West side is cold and parked across the access road." He went to the workbench. "Your road out is blocked." Walter absorbed this. "So we can't drive out." "Not that way. There's a service track that runs north from the woodshed. It connects to the county maintenance road about 1.5 miles up the ridge. My truck might make it in these conditions." "Might not." He picked up the Motorola and the antenna lead he'd been soldering. "Before we talk about that, I need to finish this." "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "Extended range modification, SAR unit. The antenna lead needs a proper solder joint and a matching coil I haven't wound yet." He pulled the stool to the workbench and sat down. "There's a jammer running somewhere east of us, probably in or near the vehicle that's idling. It's not perfect. I got a signal flicker on the state emergency relay a few minutes ago. If I can push this unit's output high enough, I might be able to hit the repeater during a gap." "How long?" Walter asked. 40 minutes, maybe less if the coil goes cleanly." Eleanor looked at Walter. Walter looked at his hands. "We'll be quiet," Eleanor said. Elias nodded and picked up the soldering iron. He worked fast but not rushed, which was a discipline. Rushing soldering joints produced cold welds that failed under vibration. He'd had that lesson demonstrated on a mountain rescue 300 feet down a rock face, when a radio had cut out mid-transmission and cost them 40 minutes of coordination time. He'd never rushed a connection since. The main room was quiet except for the fire and the wind. Eleanor had her eyes closed but wasn't sleeping. He could see the tension in her jaw. Walter was staring at the middle distance in the way of someone running the same calculation over and over and getting the same answer each time. Ranger moved once, to the west wall, stood there for 90 seconds, went back to the wood stove. The coil took 32 minutes. The antenna-lead junction took another 11. He burned the tip of his left index finger on the iron and swore once, quietly, and wrapped the finger in electrical tape because he didn't want to waste time on the first aid kit. At 9:47, he keyed the modified Motorola and ran a sweep. The signal flicker came back, channel 7, longer this time, almost 2 full seconds. He had the mic up before the gap closed. "This is Elias Boone, Frost Ridge Sector, coordinates 40.73 by 105.91, requesting emergency relay contact, potential 10 to 57 and 10 to 38. Over." Static. He waited. Watched the indicator. At 9:51, the gap came back. He repeated the transmission word for word, static. On the third gap, 9:58, he got 3 words back through the noise. Broken, half submerged in static, but 3 words he could parse. Say again, location. Someone had heard him. He repeated the coordinates and added, elderly couple, exposure risk, potential threat situation, communications jamming active, need law enforcement and medical. Boone, Frost Ridge, out. He had no way to know if it went through complete. He clipped the radio to his belt and went back to the couch. "I got a partial contact on the county relay," he said. "It may have gone through. It may not have. We can't count on it." "So we're still on our own," Walter said. "For now." Elias sat on the chair. "Tell me about Nathan, not the legal situation. Him. How does he think?" Walter looked uncomfortable. Eleanor answered. "He's patient when he thinks he's winning," she said. "He loses patience when he thinks someone is making him look stupid." A pause. "He has a temper. He's always had a temper. He learned to control it, mostly, because it cost him business." "Does he carry?" "Carry," Walter started. "A weapon." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I don't know. I wouldn't have thought so 2 months ago. Now—" She stopped. "I don't know." Elias nodded. "The people he brings with him, what kind of people are they?" "I told you, he finds people to handle things he doesn't—" A sound from outside stopped her. Not wind, not the structural settling of the cabin in cold air. A sound with intention in it, deliberate, controlled. Boots on compacted snow, moving across the porch. Ranger was on his feet before the sound registered consciously. He was facing the door, not barking, which was significant. He'd been trained to stay quiet on command, and he'd defaulted to training, which meant that somewhere in the last hour he'd registered something from Elias, a word, a posture, a shift in tone that had told him quiet is what we need. Elias crossed to the side of the door frame, not in front of it, and waited. 3 knocks. Measured, unhurried, the kind of knocking that performed calm. "Mom? Dad?" A man's voice, medium tenor, projecting careful concern into the wind. "I know you're in there. I can see the light. I just want to talk." Nobody in the room moved. "I'm not angry," Nathan said from the other side of the door. "I'm worried. You could have gotten killed out there tonight, both of you." A pause filled with wind. "Whoever's in there with them, I'm sorry for whatever story they told you. My parents are having some health difficulties, memory issues. We've been trying to get them the care they need, and it's been a really hard few months." Walter made a sound in his throat. Eleanor put her hand on his arm. Nathan's voice dropped a register, more intimate, the voice of a man confiding. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but I'm asking you, please, just let me talk to them. 5 minutes. If they want to stay, I'll leave and we can figure this out in the morning. You have my word." Elias looked at Eleanor. She shook her head, once, without any hesitation. He looked back at the door. "Mr. Hale," he said, loudly enough to carry through the wood and the storm, "your parents are safe and warm. They're not going anywhere tonight, and neither are you. Why don't you go back to your vehicle and we'll let the county sheriff sort this out in the morning?" A pause. "I appreciate that," Nathan said, with the elastic friendliness of someone recalibrating. "Really. But there are some legal complexities here that make it important that I—" "Not tonight," Elias said. Another pause. Longer. "I see." Nathan's voice had leveled out. The warmth was mostly gone now, the way a stage set looks when the lights come down. You can see the scaffolding. "Can I ask who I'm speaking with?" "Elias Boone." "Mr. Boone, do you know what you're involving yourself in?" Getting a better idea by the minute. Silence on the porch. Long enough that Elias almost moved away from the door frame. Then Nathan's voice again, quiet enough now that it barely cleared the wind. "This doesn't need to be complicated. My family is having a private dispute over estate planning, and my parents made some decisions tonight that weren't in their best interest. I'm not here to hurt anyone." A beat. "I'm sure you're a decent person. I'm asking you, one reasonable adult to another, to step back from this and let us handle our own family business." Elias said nothing. "Mr. Boone." Still nothing. The footsteps crossed the porch again, retreating. He heard them go down the steps, and then the sound was swallowed by wind, and he couldn't track them anymore. He stayed at the door frame for another 20 seconds. Then he went to the east window and put his eye to the gap in the shutter. Headlights, way back in the trees. Still there. Not moving. He stepped back. "Memory issues," Walter said flatly. "He's been using that line for a while," Eleanor said. She said it without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. "He told our bank that. He told our neighbor Roy that. He's been building a record." "Building toward a guardianship claim," Elias said. Eleanor looked at him. "You know about that?" "I've seen it. Not often, but it happens." He moved back to the workbench, not to work, just to put something solid behind him. "It's cleaner than the forged transfer. You get guardianship. You become their legal decision-maker. Nobody questions what the guardian does with assets." "Except he didn't want to wait," Walter said. "He already had the buyer. He needed the transfer done now. So he went around you, and when you ran, he followed." Elias looked at the door. "He's not going to wait much longer." Walter sat forward. His color wasn't good. He'd been pale since he came in, and exertion and cold and stress were a combination that Elias had seen do bad things to men Walter's age. His lips looked right. His breathing was regular, but he was carrying more than the physical weight of the night, and it showed. "I want to be clear about something," Walter said. He was looking at Elias steadily, in the way of a man who wanted to be sure his words landed clean. "We came here by accident. Eleanor and we didn't plan to involve anyone in this. We knocked on your door because we had no other options and Eleanor's feet were starting to go." He stopped. "If you want to open that door and walk away from this, I understand. He's my son, and I don't fully know what he's capable of right now. I wouldn't blame you for not wanting—" "Walter," Elias said. The old man stopped. "I was search and rescue for 15 years, Elias said. "I didn't get to pick which calls I took." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat back. Ranger had settled at Eleanor's feet sometime in the last few minutes, his big head resting across her ankle. She reached down without looking and set her hand on the back of his neck, and the dog's tail moved once, slow and tired. Outside, the wind found a new angle and pushed at the cabin's walls with renewed energy, as if reminding everyone inside that it was still there, still in charge, still the largest and most indifferent force in the immediate vicinity. Then, from the east side of the cabin, a sound that wasn't wind. A vehicle door, closing, not slamming, closing, which was more deliberate. Then another, a beat behind it. Elias pulled the headlamp off his workbench and turned it off, and stood in the sudden relative dark, illuminated only by the amber glow from the wood stove's grate, and listened to the sound of at least two people moving through the snow toward the cabin. Not from the front, from the side. Ranger's head came up off Eleanor's ankle. His ears went flat again, and he didn't sit back down. Two sets of footsteps in the snow. Moving along the east wall toward the southeast corner, where the cabin's two exterior walls met at a right angle, and where a person could stand without being visible from either the front windows or the side window above the kitchen sink. Elias knew that corner. He'd stood there himself on the second day after moving in, walking the property perimeter the way he always walked new ground, methodically, cataloging what you could see and what you couldn't, what gave cover and what gave concealment, old habits that had never fully switched off. He'd noted the corner as a vulnerability and thought about how to address it, and then never gotten around to it because nothing had ever come. And now here was the cost of that particular piece of procrastination. He moved fast and quiet across the main room. "Get down," he said. Not loud, just clear. Eleanor was already sliding off the couch. She took the document box with her and went to the floor behind the couch's solid pine frame, pulling Walter's arm as she went. Walter went down stiffly, one hand on the couch back, the knee giving him trouble. But he went. Ranger didn't need direction. He flattened into the space between the wood stove and the north wall, where the angle of the stone base gave him cover on two sides. 11 years, and he still remembered exactly where to go. Elias killed the two remaining lights, the workbench lamp and the kitchen overhead, by feel, without looking. The wood stove's grate threw a dull orange glow that reached maybe 4 feet in every direction and left the rest of the room in deep shadow. Anyone looking in through a window would see amber-lit smoke and darkness. He went to the east wall and pressed his back against it, 6 inches from the window frame. Through the storm shutter's gap, he couldn't see the southeast corner, wrong angle, but he could see the snow surface directly beneath the window, and when the first figure moved into the near tree line, he caught the shape of a boot print appearing and then another one, the compression pattern of someone moving deliberately and not wanting to be heard. 2 sets of prints. 2 people. Moving in from different points of the compass, converging. Classic pincer. Not sophisticated, but functional. He thought about Nathan on the porch with his measured knocking and his careful tenor voice, and he understood now that the conversation at the door had been cover, not persuasion, cover. While Nathan was performing concern at the front entrance, somebody else had been repositioning, which meant Nathan had expected Elias to refuse, which meant he'd planned past the refusal before he'd knocked. That was worth knowing. Elias moved to the kitchen. The door to the back room was 3 steps away. He went through it, kept moving to the rear exit, a solid pine door with a crossbar latch and a steel reinforcing plate he'd installed after the first winter when a late-season bear had tested the original hardware. He pressed his ear against the door and heard nothing but wind and his own pulse. He unlatched the crossbar slowly, the steel sliding through its brackets in a movement he kept controlled and even. Opened the door 2 inches. The cold hit his face like a flat hand. The back of the property was a cleared rectangle that ran 40 feet to a wood fence line, and beyond that the forest picked back up. The maintenance track he'd told them about ran along the fence's north edge. In the storm, the fence posts were barely visible, gray suggestions at the edge of the woodshed's overhang light, which was solar-charged and still running at maybe 30%, giving out a faint yellow wash that barely cleared the snow surface. Nothing moving, no compression marks in the drifted snow behind the cabin. They hadn't come around the back yet. He eased the door closed, relatched it, and stood in the back room in the dark for 3 seconds, running the situation. 2 people east and south. Probably one more on the west where the truck was parked. Nathan somewhere, front of the property, most likely, which is where command position felt natural to a man who was used to running things from a remove. Jammer still operational, which meant the vehicle running east was still the source and still staffed. So minimum 4 people. Nathan plus 3, possibly 5. Against one retired SAR specialist with a bum left knee and a half-finished radio modification on his workbench. He went back to the main room. There are 2 people working around the east side, he said quietly to the floor behind the couch. They haven't hit the back yet. We have a few minutes. He crouched down to their level. In the wood stove's glow, Walter's face was tight, the vertical crease between his brows deepened by shadow. Eleanor's was still. Here's what I need from both of you. Honestly. Walter, how's the knee? Can you move if you need to? I can move, Walter said. That wasn't the question. A beat. It'll slow me down, not stop me. Eleanor, he looked at her. There's a passage under this floor. Access hatch is in the back room behind the gear chest. It runs the length of the cabin south to north. The north end opens into a floor vent at the base of the woodshed. From the woodshed, the maintenance track is 20 feet north along the fence line. He paused. There's an equipment shed another half-mile up that track. Predates the cabin by about 20 years. Old Forest Service maintenance building. It's not heated, but it's solid. And there's an emergency radio unit mounted inside, left there by the county about 7 years ago. Old gear, but it runs on its own dedicated battery system. Different frequency band than what I've been using. You want us to go there, Eleanor said. I want you to consider going there. If that radio works and you can reach the county, it changes everything. But the track is going to be rough in this weather, and Walter's... I'll make it, Walter said. The question isn't whether you will, Elias said, and he tried to keep the edge out of his voice because the old man didn't need to be argued with right now. It's whether it's the right call. If I send you out that passage and something happens on the track, you're in the open with no shelter and no communications, and at least one vehicle blocking the access road. The maintenance track bypasses the access road, Eleanor said. He looked at her. You said it connects to the county road, she said. That's not the access road you drove us in on. Nathan's people are on your access road. The county road is the other direction. She was right. He'd said it, and she'd filed it and retrieved it faster than he'd expected. Yes, he said. Then if we move north on that track, they don't intercept us. If they don't have anyone positioned on the north side, which I haven't confirmed. A sound from outside. Not footsteps this time. Something against the exterior wall. A scraping. Then a dull impact. Something being placed against the siding. Elias was on his feet. He went back to the east window and put his eye to the gap, and what he saw was a figure. Heavy coat, knit cap pulled low, face turned away, crouching at the base of the wall with what looked like a fuel container. Red plastic. 5 gallons, maybe more. The second figure was 3 feet behind him, watching the tree line. Elias backed away from the window. They're going to smoke us out, he said. Flat, informational. He was already moving to the workbench. Or they think the threat of it will bring you out. Walter had gotten himself off the floor and was standing with one hand on the couch back. Nathan wouldn't... He stopped. The words died somewhere before they arrived because he didn't have the conviction to send them all the way. Elias pulled the emergency kit from under the workbench. Not the first aid bag, the other one, the red duffel that had his SAR field kit from the old days. He unzipped it and went by feel in the near dark. The headlamp. The emergency beacon, EPRB class, which he hadn't used because it broadcast on satellite frequencies that the ground-based jammer wouldn't touch, but which also meant the response time was measured in hours. Still. He pulled it out and set it on the workbench. The length of braided nylon cord, the folding multi-tool, 2 hand warmers, the emergency foil blankets. He found what he was actually looking for at the bottom, a compact flare kit, 4 units, the kind that went in a rescue pack because sometimes you were on a mountain at night and you needed to be seen. He looked at the foil blankets and thought about the maintenance track in a blizzard and made a decision. Eleanor. She was already beside him. Can you carry the box and move at the same time? Yes. What about Ranger? He hadn't thought about Ranger. He looked at the dog, who was still against the north wall, watching him. He knows the property better than you do, Elias said. He'll stay with you. And you? She said. I'm staying here. Walter said, That's not... Someone needs to keep their attention on this cabin while you move, Elias said. If everyone disappears, they go looking. If the cabin looks occupied, they focus here. He was packing the foil blankets and the hand warmers into a smaller bag, his mid-size pack from the duffel. He added the multi-tool and the headlamp. He pulled 2 extra batteries from the workbench drawer. The passage crawl is uncomfortable, but it's not hard. 40 feet, then you come up in the woodshed. Wait inside the shed until Ranger clears the north fence line. He'll go first. If he goes quiet and waits, you follow. If he reacts to something, you do not move. What does he react like? Eleanor asked. You'll know. He doesn't bark. He either goes still and drops his ears, which means wait, or he moves toward something, which means threat, and you go the other direction. She was listening with the fixed attention of someone who understood that the quality of her listening right now was directly connected to whether she survived the next 2 hours. How do I operate the radio at the shed? She asked. It's a standard county emergency unit. Older model, but same interface. Power button on top, frequency dial on the left, transmit key on the right side. When it powers on, it'll default to the county emergency channel. You tell them your name, you tell them you have evidence of elder financial fraud and extortion, and that there's a man named Nathan Hale and at least 3 associates attempting a forced property transfer using violence. You give them my name and this address. He reached for a scrap of paper from the workbench and wrote the address and his name and the phrase signal jamming active, rural location, and folded it and gave it to her. If the radio's dead, the EPIRB goes with you. He held up the emergency beacon. It was about the size of a large book, orange plastic, a single activation switch behind a hinged plastic guard. Flip the guard, press and hold the button for 3 seconds. It'll beep twice and start transmitting. The satellite picks it up. It won't tell them what's happening, but it gives them your coordinates and a distress signal that generates an automatic response protocol. He paused. SAR response to an EPIRB in a blizzard is going to take 90 minutes minimum, probably more, so it's a last option. Understood, she said. He zipped the pack and held it out to her. She took it. The scraping sound from outside had stopped. That was worse than the scraping. Elias went back to the east window. The fuel container was gone. So was the first figure. The second one had moved. He could see boot prints leading back toward the tree line, but the figure itself was out of his sight line. They'd repositioned. He went to the front window and looked through the shutter gap. Nathan was standing at the edge of the tree line, 25 yards out, lit by the spillover from the porch light. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and he was looking at the cabin with an expression that even at this distance and in this light read as impatience. The expression of a man who has run out of the willingness to perform patience. A figure emerged from the trees 20 feet north of Nathan and leaned in to say something. Nathan listened, nodded once, and looked back at the cabin. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back into the trees. Elias understood what that meant. Nathan had gotten a report. He'd made a decision. He was done negotiating. Go, Elias said. Now. He gave them 2 minutes to get into the passage. Eleanor first, then Walter. The old man's knee made the hatch drop a controlled difficulty, but he got down without making noise that mattered. And Ranger went last, dropping his hindquarters through the opening with the careful precision of an animal that had done this before, which he had, because Elias had used the crawl space during a training exercise 2 years ago, and the dog had followed him the way dogs followed their people everywhere, without question or complaint. The hatch closed. The back room went quiet. Elias went to the main room and fed 2 pieces of split oak into the wood stove to keep the fire going. Visible light through the grate meant occupied, meant worth watching. He turned one lamp back on, low, on the far side of the workbench. He pulled his parka on and checked the pockets by feel the way he had earlier, knife and light, and the other things that lived there. And then he stood in the middle of the room and took a slow breath and thought about what he had and what they had, and how much of a gap that was. They had numbers and vehicles and probably at least 1 firearm, though he couldn't confirm that. They had a jammer and a blocked road and the reasonable assumption that nobody in this cabin could call for help. He had a modified radio that had punched a transmission through once and might do it again. He had a building he knew better than they did. He had 15 years of operating in difficult conditions in the dark, which wasn't the same as military training. He'd said that to Walter and meant it honestly. But it wasn't nothing either. He had a bad knee and a burned finger, and he was alone. He took another breath and positioned himself at the east window. The next 8 minutes were quiet except for the storm. He counted them by the sweep second hand of the utility watch on his wrist. Another field habit. You always knew how long you'd been waiting because time distorted badly under stress, and a watch argued with the distortion. At the 9-minute mark, the east window broke. Not the glass, the storm shutter. Something hit it from outside with enough force to split the horizontal slat at its center, and the broken half swung inward and cold air poured through the gap. Elias had already moved. He'd been watching the window peripherally, not directly, and the moment the shutter moved, he stepped back and left and put the workbench between himself and the window. A hand came through the gap, not reaching for anything, testing, feeling the window frame, finding the latch, working it. Whoever this was had done something like this before or had thought carefully about how it would go. Elias let them work the latch. He needed them inside, not a broken window that announced a forced entry and gave Nathan a reason to come through the front simultaneously. The window went up. A figure came through it, big, heavier than Nathan, moving with the particular careful shuffle of someone trying to be quiet while carrying 30 extra pounds of winter gear. He was inside before Elias moved. He'd gotten one foot on the floor and was bringing the second leg over the sill when Elias stepped out from behind the workbench. "Don't," Elias said. The figure froze. He was holding a flashlight, not turned on, and a radio, and Elias saw in the ambient glow from the wood stove that he was not holding a weapon, which was something. "You're in the wrong house," Elias said. "Turn around and go back the way you came." The figure didn't move for 2 full seconds. Then his chin came up and he looked past Elias at the empty couch. The empty room. "Where are they?" he said. "Gone." Elias kept his voice even. "You spent too long on the window." It wasn't true. Eleanor and Walter were still moving through the crawl space, but the man didn't know that. The figure turned his head toward the front door, which told Elias he was thinking about signaling. He'd have a radio. He'd have been told to call in if he found them. "Don't key that radio," Elias said. The man looked back at him. He was reading Elias, trying to figure out what kind of obstacle he was dealing with. Elias knew how he appeared to outside eyes. Average height, non-threatening build, a mountain nobody in a canvas work shirt with a burned finger wrapped in electrical tape. He'd spent the better part of 2 years becoming the kind of person that drove past without registering. The man made a decision based on what he saw and reached for the radio. Elias covered the 4 feet between them in the time it took the man to get his thumb to the transmit key. He didn't hit him. He didn't need to. He took the radio wrist with his right hand and rotated it outward in a motion that controlled the joint without damaging it, the way you controlled an agitated patient on a rescue when you needed compliance without injury, and used the off-balance it created to move the man sideways into the wall beside the window. The flashlight dropped. The radio went with the wrist, pointing at the ceiling. "Quiet," Elias said. Very close now, which was uncomfortable for both of them. "I'm not going to hurt you, but you're going to sit down and you're going to stay quiet, and in the morning you can walk away from this and not be associated with whatever Nathan Hale is looking at criminally. That's the offer." The man's breathing was fast, but he wasn't fighting. "Who are you?" he said. "Nobody," Elias said. "Sit down." He got the man seated on the floor with his back against the east wall and used the nylon cord from the emergency kit to secure his wrist to the iron radiator pipe that ran along the baseboard. Old system, non-functional, but solid. He wasn't brutal about it. He left enough slack that the man wouldn't lose circulation in the cold. "You're going to get in serious trouble for this," the man said. His voice had shifted. Not threatening, more like he was genuinely trying to figure out how the night had gone sideways. "You broke my window," Elias said. He went back to the front of the room. He checked his watch. 11 minutes since Eleanor and Walter had gone down the hatch. In 11 minutes, moving carefully in a crawl space with a bad knee and an 11-year-old dog, they might have reached the woodshed. They might not have. He couldn't know, and he couldn't check, and not knowing was the worst part of this kind of work. It had always been the worst part. On mountain operations, the period between deployment and confirmation when you had no information and the imagination filled the gap with everything that could go wrong. He pulled the Motorola off his belt and ran a scan. The interference had thickened in the last 30 minutes. The gaps he'd been catching had narrowed. Whoever was running the jammer had either adjusted it or switched to a higher-powered mode, maybe triggered by the partial transmission he'd gotten through earlier. He clipped the radio back to his belt. The man on the floor shifted against the radiator pipe. "My name is Cole," he said. I do security work. I wasn't told what this was. I was told it was a welfare check. Elias looked at him. A welfare check at 10:30 at night in a blizzard, with a fuel canister. Cole's jaw tightened. The fuel canister, Elias said. Where is it? Silence. Where is it, Cole? Outside, Cole said. Against the south wall. I put it there. I wasn't going to use it. I was told to put it there and that would be enough. That they'd see it and come out. Elias thought about what that meant. A canister of fuel placed against a cabin wall, with elderly people inside in a blizzard at night. It didn't matter what the stated intent was. The statement that this exists and you know what it can do was its own kind of violence. How many people outside? Elias said. Cole shook his head. Elias crouched in front of him. He wasn't going to threaten the man. He'd seen what threats did to people under stress. They made them stupid and unpredictable, and you lost whatever cooperation you might have built. He just looked at him. Cole, in about 45 minutes, county law enforcement is going to reach this road. When they do, every choice you made tonight becomes part of a document, including this conversation. He paused. I'll tell them you cooperated. That matters. How many? Cole looked at the floor. 4, counting Mr. Hale. Positions? Danny's on the west side by the road. Mr. Hale and Marcus are at the front. I was supposed to go east and find an entry. He paused. Marcus has the jammer. He's running it from the truck. Elias stood up. Is Nathan armed? Another pause, longer. Cole. He had something in his coat. I don't know what. He didn't show me. Cole looked up at him. Marcus has a hunting rifle in the truck. He didn't bring it out. Why not? Mr. Hale said. Cole stopped and then made a decision about something. He said he didn't want it to look like that. He said if it looked like that, the other thing, the property thing, fell apart. He said it had to look like the old people got confused and came to him. Elias stood still for a moment with that. It was the most clarifying information he'd gotten all night. Nathan wasn't operating at random. He had a specific outcome he needed the night to produce, and that outcome required a plausible story afterward. Elderly, confused parents, voluntary reconciliation, paperwork signed under duress that could be written as signed under family guidance. A rifle in the picture destroyed all of that, which meant Nathan was constrained by his own plan in a way that gave Elias room. Not a lot of room, but some. He went to the front window and looked through the shutter gap. The tree line was still there, still dark. He couldn't see Nathan or the one called Marcus from this angle. The porch was empty. He went to the kitchen and opened the cabinet under the sink and found the 2 additional wooden dowels he kept there for window locks and brought them to the back room and added them to the rear door's bracing. He checked the back room window, small, high on the wall, frosted single pane, and confirmed it was latched from the inside with a simple twist lock that he reinforced by wedging a flathead screwdriver handle behind the latch plate. Not impenetrable, but harder and slower than the east window had been. He came back to the main room and fed the stove again. Cole was watching him. You're not scared, Cole said. He said it the way you'd report an observation that didn't fit your model of the situation. Elias didn't answer. I've done this kind of work, security contracts, things like that, for 6 years, Cole said. People get scared. It changes how they move. You're not moving scared. I'm moving cold, Elias said. The parka's in the front closet, and I keep forgetting to put it on. Cole stared at him. Outside, a new sound. Not wind, not footsteps. Something with a motor, idling up, the east vehicle, the one that had been running all evening, and Elias tracked the sound and felt it shift direction, which meant the vehicle was moving, repositioning, coming around toward the north. He checked his watch. 18 minutes since the hatch. The vehicle was coming toward the north face of the property, toward the maintenance track. He went to the back room and pressed his ear against the rear door. Somewhere out there beyond the woodshed, in the dark and the snow and the cold, Eleanor Hale was either on the maintenance track or still in the passage or in the woodshed, and a vehicle with working headlights was angling toward the same general direction. He gave himself 3 seconds of genuine uncertainty. He thought about going out, going north, intercepting. No. If he went out, Cole would work the cord loose eventually and either follow him or start yelling. And if Nathan and Marcus came to the front and found an empty cabin, they'd know everyone had gone, and they'd move to the vehicle and run the track. He needed to keep them at the cabin. He went back to the main room and picked up the Motorola. Nathan, he said, without keying the transmit button. He was thinking out loud. Nathan knows the radio is blocked. He knows I can't call out. He looked at the window. He doesn't know about the modification. He doesn't know about the partial transmission. He keyed the unit, live this time. Not on the emergency channel, on the open local channel that anyone with a standard radio could hear, including, very likely, the man named Marcus who was in the east truck running the jammer. This is a message for Nathan Hale, Elias said, keeping his voice level and unhurried. I've been in contact with Larimer County Sheriff's Dispatch since 9:58. They have my coordinates and a description of your vehicles and license plates from what your parents gave me before they fell asleep. He paused. You have maybe 40 minutes before the first units reach the county road. That's enough time to get back in your vehicles and be 3 counties away by morning. Another pause. Or you can do what you're doing and explain a fuel canister and a broken window to a sheriff's deputy. Your call. He released the transmit key. Silence from outside. The motor sound of the east vehicle had stopped. Cole was looking at him with an expression that had revised itself considerably over the last 2 minutes. Did you actually reach dispatch? He said. I told you what I told them. That's not... I know. Cole looked at the floor, then back up. They're not going to leave, he said. Mr. Hale put too much into this. He's not going to leave without... He stopped. Without the box, Elias said. Cole said nothing. Which isn't here anymore, Elias said. A long moment. Then from outside, up close, the front porch, the heavy impact of a boot against the bottom step. Then the porch boards. Then the door, not knocked on this time, hit with the heel of a fist in 2 hard strikes that were nothing like the measured knocking of an hour ago. Boone, Nathan's voice, stripped of the careful tenor now, ragged at the edges. Open this door. Elias walked to the door frame and stood beside it. We're done talking, Nathan. Where are they? Comfortable. Open the door. Come back in the morning with a badge and a warrant, and we can have that conversation. A sound from outside that wasn't words, not quite a shout, more like something contained and pressurized that had run out of container. Then boots on porch boards, heavy and fast, and the door hit in its frame as a shoulder drove into it, once, hard. The deadbolt held. The steel plate on the door frame held. But the frame itself gave a crack that Elias felt through the wall against his back. Last chance, Nathan said, breathing audible now, even through the door. Or, last chance, Boone. Open this door and give me my parents and walk away. You get nothing from this. You are nobody. You are some retired mountain hermit who stuck his nose in where it doesn't belong, and if you don't open this door in the next 30 seconds, I will make sure the next 10 years of your life are... Nathan, Elias said. Silence on the porch. Your father's chest has been bothering him all evening, Elias said through the door. The cold, probably, the stress. He's 78 years old and he's been out in a blizzard and his son showed up outside. He kept his voice even, not cruel, matter of fact. Whatever you think tonight is going to produce, what it's actually going to produce is a story that ends with your father in a cardiac unit. That's the story you're writing right now. Nothing from outside. You need to stop, Elias said. Not for me, not for them, because the alternative is something you can't walk back. 30 seconds of wind and fire and the settling of the stovepipe. Elias counted them. The porch boards shifted. Then something heavy, the distinctive dense weight of a splitting maul, its head bouncing once on the porch boards. And the door hit its frame again, this time not with a shoulder but with the flat side of the maul's head, and the wood around the deadbolt receptacle tore and the door swung open, and Nathan Hale was standing in the doorway with the cold pouring in around him and the maul raised in one hand like something elemental, something that had stopped making calculations. He was bigger than Elias had pictured from the voice, broad through the chest, hair plastered down from the snow, a man who'd been raised around physical work even if he'd spent the last 2 decades behind a desk. And he was looking at Elias with the look of someone who had stopped performing patience and had arrived at the version of himself he usually kept out of sight. Where? He said. Elias looked at the maul. He looked at Nathan's grip on it, right hand high on the handle, left hand low, weight shifted forward. He looked at Nathan's feet, right foot slightly forward, heel raised, which was not a casual stance. He looked at Nathan's face. The man was past the line he'd drawn for himself earlier, past the need for the story to be clean. He was at the place where something was going to happen, and he'd have time to figure out what it meant afterward. Elias had been at this line before. Not often. But he recognized it. He took one step back from the door and slightly to his left. "She's not here," Elias said. "The box isn't here. Your parents aren't here." He kept his hands visible at his sides. His voice stayed level with some effort. "And you can hit me with that or you can set it down, but either way, this is over." Nathan's arm brought them all up, and Elias moved. Not backward, not sideways. He moved inside Nathan's swing radius toward him, which was the last direction Nathan expected, and the maul came down past Elias's right shoulder with the air-splitting sound of 30 pounds of steel tool in motion. And Elias's right hand was already on Nathan's wrist below the maul's handle, and his left forearm was across Nathan's chest at collarbone height, and he used the forward momentum Nathan had committed to the swing to fold him, controlled, deliberate, not brutal, forward and down onto one knee on the porch boards. The maul hit the porch floor with a sound that the whole mountain could have heard. Nathan tried to recover and couldn't. The angle was wrong, and Elias had his wrist, and the posture meant Nathan's own weight was working against him in a way that physics didn't give back. He went to both knees and then his palm hit the boards. He was breathing hard. He was not hurt. He was on the ground. The wind off the mountain came through the open door and moved through the cabin and found the wood stove and made the fire shift and gutter. Nathan said nothing for a long time. Then, "Who are you?" Elias kept hold of his wrist with enough pressure to be unambiguous. "Someone who was having a quiet evening," he said. He looked up. The one called Marcus was at the tree line, 30 feet out, not moving, staring at the porch. He was big too, bigger than Cole, and he had his hands in his pockets and he was doing the calculation that people did when the situation had moved away from the script. Elias looked at him and didn't look away. Marcus didn't move. The fire in the wood stove put a long finger of orange light through the open door and across the porch boards, and it touched the steel head of the splitting maul where it had come to rest, and for a moment everything was very still. Then, from somewhere north of the property, faint, half absorbed by the storm, but unmistakable to anyone who'd spent enough time in the backcountry to know what hope sounded like at a distance, came the rising tone of an emergency siren, moving closer. The siren didn't get louder right away. It peaked and dipped with the wind, which played tricks on distance up here. A sound could seem close and then disappear for a full minute before returning twice as strong. Elias had learned that the first winter, when he'd thought a snowplow was a quarter-mile out and it had turned out to be 2 miles down the county road, its engine working through a long cut in the terrain that channeled sound in odd directions. But this one had the particular wavering quality of something moving uphill on a switchback road. Climbing. Getting closer in increments rather than all at once. Marcus heard it. His hands came out of his pockets. Nathan heard it too. He'd gone still on the porch boards. Still in a different way than before. Not the stillness of a man gathering himself, but the stillness of a man whose calculation had just been disrupted by a variable he hadn't accounted for. Elias released Nathan's wrist and stepped back. Nathan didn't move immediately. He stayed on one knee on the porch boards with his palm flat against the cold wood and his breath coming out in short white bursts, and he stared at the porch floor for long enough that Elias wondered if he was going to do something else, something worse, the way cornered things sometimes escalated before they retreated. He didn't. He put his hand on the railing and pushed himself upright. He was careful about it, deliberate, trying to recover something by the way he stood up, some remnant of the careful, composed person he'd been when he'd knocked on the door an hour ago. He got to his feet and looked at Elias and then looked past him into the cabin. The empty couch. The empty room. "Where's the box?" Nathan said. His voice was flat now. Not angry, not performing, just flat. "With your parents," Elias said. "Which is where it belongs." Nathan looked at him. He had a cut on his chin from the porch boards, a small one, seeping a thin line. He hadn't noticed it yet. "You don't understand what you've done," he said. "I've got a pretty good idea. That ranch belongs to Walter and Eleanor Hale," Elias said. "It has their names on the deed, and it has 41 years of their work in the ground, and none of that changes because you found a notary." Nathan's jaw moved. He looked away, toward the tree line, where Marcus still hadn't moved. Then back. "You're going to have a very difficult time explaining what happened here tonight." "I am," Elias said. That's going to be an inconvenient conversation. So is yours. The siren was audible continuously now, not fading between gusts. Close enough that Elias could distinguish it as two separate units, two vehicles, not one. And the sound had the particular urgency of emergency response that didn't get turned on for routine welfare checks. Someone had heard his transmission. Someone had taken it seriously and moved fast, which meant either his partial contact had gone through complete, or Eleanor had reached the shed radio, or both. He thought it was probably both. Marcus turned and walked back into the trees, not running. Walking, with the purposeful stride of someone removing themselves from a scene. Elias watched him go and didn't try to stop him. Cole was still inside, secured to the radiator pipe. Danny was somewhere on the west side, probably already moving toward his vehicle. Marcus was going for the east truck. Nathan stood on the porch and didn't move. Elias looked at him. "You can go or you can stay," he said. "If you go, you're going to get stopped at the county road because they'll have units coming from both directions once they're on the mountain. If you stay, you're already here when they arrive." He paused. "Your call. But if your father is in the condition I think he might be in, the paramedics are going to need to know his medication history. You'd know that." Something shifted in Nathan's face. It wasn't remorse. Elias wouldn't have called it that. It was more like a crack in a surface that had been under pressure for too long. And whatever was beneath the surface was complicated and not entirely what he'd expected to find there. Nathan sat down on the porch steps. He put his hands on his knees and he sat there in the snow and the wind and the cold, and he didn't say anything else. Elias left him there and went back inside. The first unit reached the property at 11:42 by Elias's watch. A Larimer County Sheriff's cruiser, chains on the tires, followed by a second cruiser and an ambulance that came in tight behind them on the narrow access road and had to pull half onto the shoulder to clear the turn into Elias's drive. The vehicles that had been in the tree line were gone. He'd heard them move out about 15 minutes earlier, both of them, heading north up the county road rather than south, which confirmed his read that they'd been planning to use the maintenance track as an escape route and had found it blocked by something. He'd find out what that was soon enough. The first deputy through the door was young, mid-20s, name tag reading Ostrowski, moving with the tight-shouldered alertness of someone who had been told possible threat situation, multiple subjects, and was taking that seriously. He had his hand near his sidearm, and his eyes did a quick sweep of the room that was thorough even if not quite practiced. He saw Elias. He saw Cole on the floor against the radiator pipe. He saw the broken window with snow blowing through the gap in the shutter. "Boone?" he said. "Yes." "Where are the civilians?" "North. Maintenance track. About a mile and a half up. Possibly at the county road by now." Elias glanced at the window. There were 4 subjects, the one on the floor, 3 others. 2 vehicles went north up the county road about 15 minutes ago. Nathan Hale is on the front porch. Ostrowski processed this in about 2 seconds and turned to the deputy behind him and said something into his radio before finishing turning. Then he looked back at Elias. "You okay?" "My window's broken." Ostrowski looked at it. "Right, sit tight." Elias didn't sit. He put his parka on, finally, and went to the front porch and told Nathan, who was still on the steps and had developed a slight shiver from the cold, that the paramedics were here and did he need anything. Nathan looked up at him with an expression that had aged considerably in the last half hour and said he was fine. Elias said okay and went back inside and put the kettle on because there was nothing else to do and he needed something to do. The second sheriff's unit had a senior deputy named Weatherspoon who was somewhere around 50 and had the blunt, unhurried manner of someone who'd spent 2 decades processing bad nights and bad weather and had stopped being surprised by the configurations they arrived in. He looked at Cole on the floor, looked at the broken window, looked at the splitting maul on the porch, and then looked at Elias for a long time. "Walk me through it," Weatherspoon said. Elias walked him through it. The kettle started to boil while he was talking, and he poured water into 2 mugs and put them on the table, and Weatherspoon took one without stopping him from talking and drank from it without looking at it. When Elias finished, Weatherspoon set the mug down. "The modification on your radio," he said. "The range extension. Is that legal?" "Gray area," Elias said. "It's my unit. I modified it for SAR use. I'm not broadcasting commercially." "Uh-huh." Weatherspoon wrote something. "The cord you used on Cole." "Standard nylon. It's still on him." "I can see that." Weatherspoon looked at him again. Army, you said. I said the Army taught me how to check a building. But you were Army. Elias looked at his mug. 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 deployments. I got out in 2008. He paused. I was search and rescue for 15 years after that. The Army was a long time ago. Weatherspoon wrote something else. His handwriting was small and precise, which didn't match his hands. The situation on the porch. With the mall. He swung it. I moved inside his radius. I put him down on the boards and I held his wrist. He wasn't hurt. You didn't hit him? No. And you released him when you heard the siren? Yes. Weatherspoon looked at him. You couldn't have known we were coming. You didn't know if your transmission went through. No. So you released him anyway. He was down, Elias said. I don't hold people down when they're not going anywhere. Weatherspoon nodded slowly. He closed the notebook. I'm going to need you to stay available, he said. Don't go far. Don't. I've got nowhere to go, Elias said. My window's broken. Sheriff Dana Cross arrived at 12:20. Elias had seen her name on county emergency communications before. She'd been the contact point for SAR coordination on 2 operations he'd assisted with after his retirement. A pattern search on the Poudre River drainage and a lost hiker recovery on Cameron Pass. He'd spoken to her on radio twice and had a clear impression of someone who gathered information before speaking, which was rarer in leadership positions than it should have been. In person, she was about 45, compact, with close-cropped gray-streaked hair and the particular economy of movement of someone who didn't waste time on gesture. She came through the door, took in the room, spoke to Weatherspoon for 90 seconds, and then came to where Elias was standing by the workbench. Mr. Boone. Not warm, not cold, functional. Your radio modification, can it still transmit? If there are gaps in the interference, the jammer was in the east vehicle and it left with the vehicle, so if your units have the truck stopped somewhere north, they do, she said. Marcus Teal. He's in custody at the county road junction with a Type 3 signal jammer that he does not have a license for. She looked at the Motorola on the workbench. We got your partial transmission at 21:58 and again at 22:11. The second one had enough content to generate a response. We were already mobilizing when the county road unit called in a woman and an elderly man on foot in the storm, about 1.3 miles up the maintenance track. Elias let out a breath. He hadn't realized he'd been holding it. Eleanor got the shed radio working? She got out to the county road, Cross said. The maintenance shed radio was dead. The battery system had failed at some point in the last year. She had an EPIRB unit she activated at the roadside. We had the satellite ping before the first unit reached the mountain. Elias thought about Eleanor Hale activating an EPIRB at the side of a mountain road in a blizzard with an elderly husband and an aging dog, and he thought that he had undersold her to himself in his initial assessment, which was a mistake he made sometimes. Walter, he said. Medics are with them at the road junction now, Cross said. He's ambulatory. They're assessing. She watched his face. He's okay, Mr. Boone. He's talking too much, which is a good sign. Elias nodded. Cross turned slightly and looked at the porch through the open door, where Nathan was now in the custody of Ostrowski and a second deputy, and was sitting in the back of a cruiser with the door open and a foil blanket around his shoulders. His posture had changed entirely since the porch. He sat in the back seat with the careful stillness of someone who had been processed, not broken, not remorseful, but recalculated. He was looking out the window toward the tree line with an expression that Elias couldn't read from this distance. Nathan Hale, Cross said, you had a conversation with him at the door, before the breach. 2 conversations, one through the door, one face-to-face on the porch. What was your read? Elias thought about it honestly, because she'd asked honestly, and she was the kind of person you gave honest answers to. He was running a plan that had a specific outcome requirement. He needed his parents to come out voluntarily, or he needed the box in a way that didn't leave obvious marks. He thought it through carefully. He paused. When it stopped working, he stopped being careful. Cross absorbed this. The mall. He brought it up. I moved inside his radius. She looked at him directly. 75th Rangers, she said. He looked at her. Weatherspoon told you. He mentioned it, yes. It was 18 years ago, Elias said. It's not what I am now. I'm not suggesting it is. She held his gaze. I'm suggesting it explains why a retired mountain SAR specialist managed to control a physical altercation with a larger man in the dark without injury to either party, while simultaneously maintaining two civilians in cover and running a modified radio at a jammer's interference gaps. She let that sit for a second. Which is not a complaint, Mr. Boone. I'm just accounting for the pieces. Elias looked at the workbench. The Baofeng was still there, half stripped. The Kenwood. The Motorola with its modified antenna lead, the coil he'd wound in the dark, while an old couple sat on his couch and tried not to show how frightened they were. I moved here to stop doing things like this, he said. I know, Cross said. That's obvious. She picked up her radio and exchanged 3 terse sentences with someone on the other end about vehicle positions. Then she looked back at him. It's also obvious you can't help it. He didn't answer that. She didn't wait for him to. The hospital in Fort Collins was 90 minutes down the mountain on cleared roads, and the roads were not cleared. The ambulance made it in 140 minutes, running steady behind a county plow unit, and Elias knew this because Cole had been taken in a separate vehicle and Ostrowski had radioed in the departure times, and Elias had been listening to the traffic on the Motorola while he taped a sheet of heavy plastic over the broken east window to stop the wind. He finished the taping at around 1:15 and stood back and looked at it. It was ugly. It would hold until morning, maybe into the next day if the wind didn't get under the edges. He'd need to source a replacement pane from the hardware in LaPorte, which was a 40-minute drive on a good day. He went to the wood stove and opened the loading door and looked at the fire. It had burned down to coals while he'd been managing the last 2 hours, and he rebuilt it from the wood box, 2 pieces of pine to catch, then a larger piece of oak to sustain, and closed the door and sat on the floor in front of it with his back against the couch. His knee had been talking to him for the last hour, not screaming, it wasn't that kind of pain, more like a sustained commentary that he'd been ignoring and that was now becoming insistent. He straightened the leg and felt the familiar click at the joint and left it extended on the floor. The fire was quiet. The storm had downgraded in the last 40 minutes. The wind still moved, but the snapping gusts had become a steadier pressure, which meant the front was through and what remained was the trailing edge. By morning, the sky might actually clear. He sat there and didn't think about much. He was still sitting there when Weatherspoon came back in at 1:40. The deputy looked at him on the floor and then at the wood stove, and then walked to the kitchen and found 2 mugs in the cabinet, which required 3 tries because he didn't know the kitchen. He poured from the kettle that Elias had kept on the back burner and brought both mugs back and set one on the floor next to Elias and took the straight-back chair. Danny Foss, Weatherspoon said, the one on the west side. We picked him up a mile north of the property on foot. He'd gone into the ditch trying to turn around on the road and couldn't get his vehicle out. He drank from his mug. He's a local, does odd jobs. Says Nathan found him at a bar in Estes 2 days ago and offered him $300 to drive a truck up a mountain. You know what he was driving into? He says no. I believe him. Maybe 60%. Weatherspoon turned his mug in his hands. Teal, Marcus Teal, has priors. 2 B&E convictions in Pueblo, 1 assault charge that was pled down. He's been doing contract work for a security firm in Denver. That firm has done work for Nathan Hale's development company. So Teal was the professional. Cole Riggs, your guy on the floor, did 2 tours as an Army MP before getting out and doing private work. He's been with the same security firm as Teal for about 3 years. Weatherspoon looked at him. You handled an Army MP in a 4-foot ceiling crawl space access point. I didn't handle him in the crawl space, Elias said. He came through the window. Right. Weatherspoon drank. You want to tell me how that went specifically? I told you how it went. You told me you took his radio wrist and rotated it and put him against the wall. MP training is wrist lock resistance. He paused. I'm not asking for legal reasons. I'm asking because I'm curious. Elias looked at the fire through the grate. He hesitated, he said. He was reading me, and he was deciding I wasn't a threat, which is a decision I've benefited from before. When he reached for the radio, I was already moving. He paused. He's not a bad person. He didn't know what this was. He broke your window. Everybody makes mistakes. Weatherspoon made a sound that might have been a laugh. Nathan Hale's attorney called the department at 12:50, he said, which is fast. Either he had a number ready or the attorney was already expecting the call. He set his mug on the floor. The attorney is claiming that Eleanor Hale has early-stage dementia and that Walter Hale was under undue influence from an unknown third party, you, presumably, when he made statements to law enforcement. Eleanor Hale navigated a crawl space, a maintenance track, and an ePirby activation in a blizzard at night while carrying a document box and managing an elderly husband with a bad knee, Elias said. She did it in the right sequence in the right direction with equipment she'd been briefed on once for less than 3 minutes. I know, Weatherspoon said. I'm not disputing it. I'm telling you what the attorney said. He paused. Sheriff Cross is going to want a formal statement from you in the morning. Probably late morning, given the roads. You'll want to be thorough. I can be thorough. The radio modification, Weatherspoon said. The range extension. Don't bring it up in your statement unless they ask directly. And if they ask, say you were performing routine maintenance and were testing the antenna output when you caught the signal gap. He paused. Gray area is better navigated when you don't draw a map to it. Elias looked at him. Weatherspoon shrugged with the elaborate nonchalance of a man who had spent 20 years finding the practical line between the law as written and the law as workable. You got 2 elderly people out of a bad situation, he said. I'm not interested in building a secondary file about antenna modifications. Elias nodded. Appreciate that. Weatherspoon stood up. He picked up both mugs and took them to the kitchen and left them in the sink. He pulled his coat from where he'd draped it over the chair. The attorney's going to argue Nathan was acting under emotional stress, he said from the kitchen. Family conflict escalated by misunderstanding. He'll frame them all as an impulsive action by a desperate man trying to reach his parents, not an assault. He came back to the main room. Does that make you angry? Elias thought about it. No, he said. That's his job. The documents in Eleanor's box, Weatherspoon said. If they're what she says they are, the attorney's framing falls apart. Forged notarization and prearranged property transfer accounts are hard to explain as emotional family conflict. He pulled his coat on. So it comes down to what's in that box. Then it'll be fine, Elias said. Weatherspoon looked at him. I saw Eleanor Hale walk into a blizzard with it rather than leave it behind, Elias said. Those documents are real. The deputy stood there for a moment, then nodded once and went to the door. He stopped in the frame. Rangers, he said. Not a question exactly. 3rd Battalion, Elias said. A long time ago. My brother-in-law was 2nd Battalion, Weatherspoon said. Different era. He looked at the plastic-sheeted window. You should get that window fixed before the next storm. Forecast has more coming Thursday. Then he went out and pulled the door behind him, and the latch caught, and the cabin was quiet. Elias got off the floor at 2:30 and ate the venison stew cold, standing at the stove, because he didn't have the patience to wait for it to reheat, and his body had decided it needed something now. It tasted the way cold stew always tasted, dense and flat and satisfying in a purely functional way. He ate the whole pot. He was washing the pot when his cell phone rang. He looked at it. Unknown number, Colorado area code. He answered. Mr. Boone, Eleanor's voice, thin, slightly distorted by whatever hospital connection she was using, but steady. I hope it's not too late to call. It's not, he said. Walter is stable. They're keeping him overnight for observation. His blood pressure was too high, and his chest, it turned out to be muscular. They think. They're doing more tests in the morning. A pause. He wanted me to call. Tell him I'm glad he's okay. He wants to know if Ranger is all right. Elias looked across the room. Ranger was on his sleeping pad by the wood stove, on his side, back legs loose, breathing with the deep regularity of an animal that had decided tonight was over and had exited efficiently. He'd been asleep since 11:30. He's fine, Elias said. Tell Walter he handled himself better than most 2-legged partners I've had. A sound from Eleanor's end, almost a laugh. Not quite. I'll tell him that. She paused. The sheriff. Cross. She was here about an hour ago. She wanted to see the box. And? And she spent 40 minutes going through it with a forensic tech they brought up from Fort Collins. A pause. She didn't say much when she was done, but the tech, he photographed everything twice and bagged the originals separately and handled them like they were another pause. Like they mattered. They do. Yes. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Mr. Boone, Elias, I've been trying to think of what to say to you since we left the cabin, and I haven't been able to find the right word. Not thank you exactly. That's too… Eleanor, he said. She stopped. You activated the EPIRB, he said. In a blizzard, on foot, with inadequate footwear, after navigating 40 feet of crawl space in the dark. You called it in, you had the documents, and you got them out. He paused. I kept a door closed for a few hours. That's what I did. Silence on the line. The distortion of a hospital phone and the sound of the mountain wind still pushing at his cabin walls. That's not true, she said finally. No, he said, but it's closer to true than the other way around. She didn't argue with it. He respected that. The ranch, she said. Sheriff Cross says it's going to be a complicated process. The attorney Nathan has… She says it could take months. Probably, Elias said. Legal things take time. But the documents are real, and the notarization is forged, and you have a witness log of everything that happened tonight from multiple law enforcement officers. He rinsed the pot. Nathan's attorney is good at his job. So is Margaret, I'd guess. It'll take time. It'll work out. You sound certain. He wasn't certain. He was a man with a broken window and a bad knee who'd spent his evening managing a situation he hadn't been trained for in about a decade and a half. And he was running on cold stew and adrenaline residue and the particular hollow clarity that came after bad nights. But Eleanor didn't need his uncertainty right now. I'm certain about the documents, he said. The rest follows from that. She was quiet for a moment. Walter says you were in the army. A long time ago. He says that explains it. A pause. I told him it doesn't explain everything, that some people are just… She stopped. Get some sleep, Eleanor, he said. Yes. He heard her shift the phone. Elias. The dog. The way he was with me in the crawl space, and on the track. He stayed right beside Walter the whole time. He's good at finding things that need finding. He's a good dog, she said simply, and the simplicity of it landed with more weight than a longer sentence would have. Yeah, Elias said. He is. After she hung up, he stood at the kitchen sink for a moment, looking at the dark window above it. His reflection was a gray smudge in the glass. The parka, the burned finger with its electrical tape wrap, the lines around his eyes that were deeper than they'd been at 30 and would be deeper still at 50 if he got there. He turned the kitchen light off and the reflection disappeared. He checked the wood stove. The fire was settled and would run until 4, maybe 5, and he checked the plastic sheeted window which was holding, and he checked the back door's crossbar, which was still seated, and then he went to the workbench and looked at the 3 radios laid out there. The Baofeng he'd been nursing back to life. The Kenwood stripped for parts. The Motorola with its modified antenna LED, and the coil he'd wound in 43 minutes, while 2 old people waited on his couch and tried not to show how frightened they were. He picked up the Baofeng and turned it over in his hands. Looked at the solder joint on the antenna lead. It was clean. Not elegant, but clean. He set it down. Ranger exhaled loudly from his sleeping pad and shifted his weight and settled again. Elias pulled the straight-back chair to the workbench and sat down and picked up the soldering iron and let it start to warm. He had work to finish. The Baofeng needed its matching coil and another 3 connections before it would be usable, and the Kenwood parts weren't going to sort themselves. And there were 2 more units in the back room that he'd gotten from the county SAR depot auction 6 months ago that he hadn't even opened the cases on yet. Outside, the wind was steady, but lighter than it had been. The storm was passing. In 4 or 5 hours, the sky would lighten, and the snow would stop, and the roads would start to clear, and the night would become the kind of past that you carried in a specific place. Not forgotten, not dramatized, just carried. The soldering iron reached temperature. Elias got back to work. The Baofeng was finished by 4:15 in the morning. Elias set it on the workbench beside the Motorola and looked at the 2 units and thought about nothing in particular for about 30 seconds. Then he turned off the soldering iron, washed the solder flux off his hands in the kitchen sink, and went to bed. He slept until 9, which was 2 hours longer than usual, and woke up to pale winter light coming through the south window, and Ranger standing at the side of the bed with his chin on the mattress edge, which was how the dog communicated that breakfast was running late without being rude about it. Yeah, Elias said. Give me a minute. The storm had passed. The sky outside the south window was the hard, bright blue that came after a front moved through, the kind of blue that made the snow surface look like it had been lacquered. The pines along the east tree line were loaded white, their branches bent under the weight of the accumulation, and the property looked clean and still and completely peaceful in the way that places look peaceful after bad things have happened in them, as if the landscape itself had absorbed the night and filed it away. He fed Ranger and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window drinking it. The plastic sheet over the east window held. The crossbar on the back door was still seated. Everything was where he'd left it at 4 in the morning, which he'd half expected not to be the case, because nights like the one he'd just had a tendency to leave their marks on the physical space they'd moved through. But the cabin looked like a cabin. The workbench was a workbench. The splitting maul was still on the porch. He could see its handle through the front window, and that was the only thing that looked out of place, and he went out and picked it up and brought it inside and put it in the back room with the other tools, because it was a good maul, and it was cold, and the weather would check the steel eventually. Sheriff Cross called at 10:40. "The formal statement," she said. "Can you be at the LaPorte substation by 1? Roads clear enough? County road is plowed. Your access road's going to be rough for the first quarter mile, then it's fine." He drove down in the truck, 4-wheel drive, Ranger riding in the back seat, because the dog had watched him put on his jacket and coat with the focused attention that meant, "I'm coming," and Elias hadn't argued. The access road was worse than rough for the first quarter mile. It was a single set of ruts through 2 feet of blown snow, and he kept his speed at 5 miles an hour and let the truck find its footing, but it opened up at the county road junction, and from there the plow had been through twice and the driving was straightforward. The LaPorte substation was a converted ranch building with 3 cruisers in the lot and a folding table in the main room with a coffee urn on it that had been there long enough to qualify as furniture. Cross met him at the door. "Ranger can stay in the truck or he can come in," she said. Elias opened the rear door and Ranger jumped down and walked in ahead of both of them, which settled that question. The formal statement took 90 minutes. Cross took it herself, not a deputy, which told him something about how the department was characterizing the night. She asked careful questions in a linear order and let him answer without interruption, and when he finished each section, she asked one follow-up question, never more than one, that clarified whatever she'd identified as a gap. She asked about the radio modification. He said routine maintenance and antenna output test, which was what Weatherspoon had suggested, and she wrote it down and moved on. She asked about the physical altercation with Nathan on the porch with the maul. He described it in the same terms he'd used with Weatherspoon: inside the radius, risk control, controlled placement on the boards. She asked how long he'd been out of the Rangers. He said 18 years. She asked if he'd had any law enforcement or security employment since. He said no, only SAR. She wrote it down. When the statement was complete, she had him read it and initial each page and sign the last one, and she sat back in her chair and looked at him. "Nathan Hale's attorney filed for an emergency injunction this morning to suppress the documents as illegally obtained," she said, "on the grounds that Eleanor Hale removed them from Nathan's briefcase without consent." "Eleanor Hale took photographs of documents from a briefcase that was left in her house," Elias said, "which is her house." The attorney's argument is more technical than that, but yes, that's essentially the core of it. Cross looked at her notes. The judge denied the injunction at 9:15 this morning. The forensic team's preliminary finding is that the notarization stamp is fraudulent. The notary whose stamp was used is licensed in Colorado, but died 14 months ago. Whoever Nathan found used a dead notary's credentials. Elias absorbed this. That's not a careful plan. No, Cross said. It's a plan that was moving fast because the buyer in Phoenix had a deadline. According to the financial records we pulled from the account Eleanor photographed, Nathan had already received a $200,000 deposit against the sale. She paused. He needed the transfer complete by the end of the month, which explained the timeline, which explained the blizzard, which explained the mall. What's he facing? Elias asked. Formally? Elder financial abuse under Colorado statute is a Class 3 felony. Conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful use of a deceased person's credentials for notarization. The signal jamming, Marcus Teal, is federal, FCC territory, and that gets complicated, but it's real exposure. She paused. The assault charge against Nathan himself is going to depend on how the DA characterizes the mall incident. You weren't injured. He'll claim emotional distress. I told you he would. You did. She looked at him directly. For what it's worth, Mr. Boone, I've been in this county for 11 years. I've seen elder financial abuse cases before. I've seen them fail in court because the documentation was incomplete or the family dynamic made it look ambiguous. She paused. This one is not ambiguous, and the documentation is not incomplete. Eleanor made sure of that, Elias said. Eleanor made sure of that, Cross agreed, and you made sure Eleanor had the opportunity. Elias looked at Ranger, who had found a corner of the room and was lying there watching the door with the patient attention of an animal that had no particular agenda for the afternoon. Cole Riggs, Elias said. We released him this morning, pending review. She paused. He gave a full statement voluntarily. Named Nathan as the employer, described the assignment as presented to him, which was, as he said, represented as a welfare check. His attorney's making a cooperation argument. A beat. I expect he'll be looking for different work going forward. He's not a bad person, Elias said. Cross looked at him with an expression that was close to amusement, but not quite. So you said in your statement. He drove back up the mountain in the early afternoon. The light was already going flat by 3 o'clock, the way it did in December at this elevation, the sun dropping behind the western ridgeline and leaving a long blue shadow that ran down the slope and swallowed the snow surface from west to east like a slow tide. He made the turn onto his access road and drove it slowly and got the truck into the shed and killed the engine and sat there for a minute in the quiet. He'd forgotten to pick up window glass in LaPorte. He sat with that for a moment. Then he got out of the truck. Walter called 4 days later. Not Eleanor. Walter, which meant he'd waited until he was well enough to make the call himself, rather than have it made for him. His voice was stronger than it had been in the cabin. The particular fragile quality it had carried through that night was gone, replaced by something more like its natural register. Still careful, still deliberate, but present. I wanted to call when I could put 2 sentences together without forgetting the first one, Walter said. How are you feeling? Like someone who walked a mile in a blizzard and then had an argument with his son and then got in an ambulance. A pause. So, about like you'd expect. A beat. The doctor says my heart is fine, structurally. My blood pressure needs adjustment and I need to cut out the salt, which Eleanor has been waiting for an excuse to enforce for about 6 years, so. He stopped. Elias. Walter. I looked you up, the old man said, after we got home. 3rd Battalion, 75th Rangers, Kandahar, 2 Silver Stars. I found the second one in a news archive from 2007. Elias was quiet. I'm not going to make a thing of it, Walter said. I wanted you to know that I looked and that I know and that it explains some things from that night that I'd been trying to put together. A pause. And it makes what you did seem, I don't know, more deliberate, I suppose. Like it wasn't just someone reacting, like it was a choice. It was a choice, Elias said. I know. Walter's voice had something in it now that wasn't easy to name. Not gratitude. They'd moved past the gratitude vocabulary. Something older and more specific. I was in the Army too. Long before your time. Vietnam, 69 to 71. I was nobody special. Infantry, line unit. But I remember what it cost to come home and find something quiet to do and stay there. He stopped. I remember how hard that was. Elias looked at the east window. He'd gotten the glass in LaPorte 2 days after the statement, a trip he'd made with a list of 3 things and come back with all 3 and nothing else, which was unusual for him. The new pane was in and caulked and the shutter was repaired and the wall looked the same as it had before. Almost. I'm okay here, Elias said. It's the right place. I believe you, Walter said. I'm not trying to suggest otherwise. A pause. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that no is a complete answer. There's nothing owed in either direction. Go ahead. Eleanor and I have been talking to Sheriff Cross about what happened, the communication situation, being up on that mountain with no way to reach anyone. It almost... He stopped, started again. There are other families up there, in those isolated communities along the county road. Frost Ridge, but also Pine Brook and the North Valley settlements. People who aren't retired search and rescue with modified radios. A pause. Cross has been trying to get funding for an emergency repeater network on that mountain system for 3 years. She can't get it through the county budget. I know, Elias said. I've talked to her about it before. You have, Walter sounded surprised. Twice. The proposal is solid. The budget committee keeps kicking it. Yes, Walter said. Well, Eleanor and we've been talking to our lawyer, Margaret, and the ranch, when this is resolved, and it will be resolved, Cross is confident about that. There are things we've been meaning to do with the property income that we never got around to. A pause. Margaret thinks the repeater network could be funded through a private community safety grant. If someone with the right background could help design the technical specifications and present the proposal to the county. Elias looked at the Motorola on the workbench, the Baofeng beside it, the Kenwood, fully stripped, its parts laid out in neat rows. I know what the right background looks like, Walter said carefully, but I also know it's your time and your choice. You want me to spec the network, Elias said. I want to ask if you'd be willing to, Walter said. Yes. The fire in the wood stove made a small settling sound. Ranger shifted on his sleeping pad. Elias thought about the night he'd spent with his face against a cold foundation vent, watching boot prints appear in the snow. He thought about Eleanor's voice on a hospital phone at 2 a.m, precise and clear and faintly amused. He thought about Marcus Teal's jammer and the 2 seconds of open channel he'd punched a transmission through, and how those 2 seconds had been enough, how they'd almost not been enough. I can spec the network, he said. The legal process moved the way. Legal processes moved, not fast, not clean, and with several moments where it seemed like it might go sideways before it didn't. Nathan's attorney was good. He filed 4 separate motions in the first month, each one designed to complicate the evidentiary picture, and 2 of them required responses that Margaret had to argue in front of a judge in Denver. But the dead notary's credentials were the wall that every motion broke against. You couldn't explain away a stamp belonging to a woman who'd been dead for 14 months. Nathan's attorney tried. He argued that Nathan had used the stamp in good faith, unaware of the notary's death, that it had been provided by a third-party document service. The DA produced a phone record showing Nathan had called the document service 11 days after the notary's death, which collapsed the good faith argument into something that wasn't good faith anymore. Nathan Hale pled guilty to elder financial abuse and conspiracy to commit fraud in March, 7 weeks before the scheduled trial date. His attorney negotiated a sentence of 4 years with possibility of parole at 2, plus full restitution and a permanent bar from serving as a fiduciary or legal representative for any family member in the state of Colorado. Elias heard about the plea from Cross, who called him on a Wednesday afternoon while he was on the floor of the equipment shed at Frost Ridge replacing a battery pack on a county emergency unit, which was where he spent about 3 afternoons a week now, because the network specification had grown into something larger than a proposal. It had become a project, and the project had become ongoing. Nathan Hale, Cross said, pled this morning. Elias set down the battery pack. What did Eleanor say? She said she was sorry it took this long, and that she hoped he'd use the time to figure out how he'd gotten there. Cross paused. She also said she wasn't angry, which I found that remarkable, honestly. She's not a remarkable person, Elias said. She's just decided not to carry things that don't belong to her. A silence on Cross's end. That's a good way to put it. Caroline Hale, Nathan's sister, who had been named in the original complaint as a co-conspirator in the fraud, had cooperated with investigators early and completely, providing records of financial communications with Nathan dating back 18 months. The DA had declined to prosecute her in exchange for the cooperation and a civil settlement that returned a sum of money she'd received from Nathan's initial deposit back to an escrow account. She'd called Walter and Eleanor in February, a call that Elias hadn't been present for and hadn't asked about. Whatever was said on that call was between the 3 of them. Marcus Teal received federal charges for the signal jamming and a separate state charge for the assault-related elements of the night. He pled down in a separate process. Cole Riggs was not prosecuted. Danny Foss, the man who'd parked his truck on Elias's access road for $300 in cash, was issued a citation and a conditional discharge. The ranch remained in Walter and Eleanor Hale's names. It had never, legally, left them. April came late to Frost Ridge, the way spring always came late at elevation, grudgingly, in increments, the snow retreating upslope rather than disappearing, leaving behind a mud season that was its own particular challenge for mountain roads. The maintenance track that Eleanor had walked in December was soft and rutted by April and impassable by vehicle until mid-month. Walter and Eleanor drove up on the 18th. A Saturday, clear, the temperature at 43 degrees by 10 in the morning when their truck, a working ranch truck, not new, with a cracked taillight and mud on the running boards, pulled into Elias's drive. He heard them coming and was on the porch when they pulled in. Ranger was beside him, sitting with his weight forward, ears up. He hadn't met these people since December, but his nose had its own memory, and both ears rotated as the truck doors opened. Walter got out first. He moved better than he had in December. The knee that had troubled him in the crawl space was the same knee that troubled most men his age, but he carried it with the straightforward impatience of someone who'd decided the knee was not in charge. He looked at the cabin, at the tree line, at the east wall. "You got the window fixed," he said. "Eventually," Elias said. Eleanor came around the truck with a covered pot that she held with both hands. She looked at the porch and at the splitting maul, which Elias had not put back outside since December, and then she looked at Elias. "Venison stew," she said. "I called the sheriff's department and asked if you had food allergies. Deputy Weatherspoon said you probably lived on coffee and spite, and I should bring a full pot. I'll have to thank him for that." She came up the porch steps and handed him the pot, and he took it, and it was heavy and hot, and smelled like the kind of cooking that came out of a kitchen where someone had been doing it for 40 years. She was wearing a canvas coat he hadn't seen before, and her hair was different. Not dramatically, but lighter, more settled. She looked like a person who had put something down and not picked it back up. They ate at the kitchen table, 3 of them and Ranger, who stationed himself between Walter's chair and the wood stove, and received several pieces of venison that Walter dropped with a casualness that suggested this had been a habit forming since December. "The network," Walter said. "Cross showed us the proposal, the technical specifications." "It's a starting point," Elias said. "The county has to approve the repeater sites, which is a process. The funding structure Margaret set up should hold the grant for 18 months, which gives us time to work the approvals." She said there were 3 communities that would be covered. 5 if the Northern Relay goes in. Frost Ridge, Pine Brook, 2 settlements in the North Valley, and a cluster of properties on the county road past the maintenance junction. Maybe 40 households total. He paused. Not a lot of people, but they're the ones who don't have options when the weather goes bad. Walter looked at him for a moment. "You're going to run it," he said. Not a question. "I'm going to spec it and present it," Elias said. "Whether I run it depends on what the county decides about structure." "You're going to run it," Walter said again, the same way. Elias didn't disagree a second time. Eleanor was watching the east window, the repaired pane, the rehung shutter. She had a way of looking at things that wasn't exactly sentimental, but wasn't unsentimental either. More like someone taking an accurate account. "It was a strange night," she said. "December." "It was," Elias said. "I've been thinking about what you said on the phone, that you kept a door closed and I did the rest." She turned from the window. "I've been thinking about whether that was modesty or whether you actually believed it." "Somewhere in between," he said honestly. She nodded. "What I know is that I walked into that cabin not knowing what kind of person was going to open the door. Walter and I have been talking about that. What it means to knock on a stranger's door when you have nowhere else to go." She paused. "We got very lucky." "You got a SAR specialist with insomnia and a half-finished radio," Elias said. "We got someone who opened the door," she said. "That's the part that wasn't luck." The table went quiet for a moment. The wood stove settled. Ranger exhaled. Walter reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and pulled out an envelope and set it on the table. He didn't push it toward Elias, just set it there. "That's not payment," Walter said. "I know you won't take payment. It's a letter, from me and Eleanor both." He paused. "For the county commission review of the network proposal. Character reference and formal endorsement of the project. Margaret says that having community members on the record strengthens the application." Elias looked at the envelope. "That's useful," he said. "There's also a second letter in there," Eleanor said. "From us personally. You don't have to read it now." "I'll read it tonight," he said. Walter stood up first, and Elias stood with him, and they shook hands, the way men shook hands when they had run out of other language. Firm, brief, a full grip. Walter's hand was rough from 40 years of ranch work, and it felt like shaking hands with the proof of something. Eleanor hugged him, which he hadn't expected. She was smaller than he'd registered in December, and the hug was brief and unpretentious, and she stepped back immediately and straightened her coat. "The dog," she said. She was looking at Ranger. Elias looked at him too. Ranger walked to Eleanor and sat in front of her and looked up, and she crouched down, slowly, carefully, the way people who've learned to be careful crouched, and put both hands on the sides of his face. The dog's tail moved, not the fast, anxious movement of a dog performing happiness, the slow, certain movement of an animal that recognized someone. "Good dog," she said quietly. He held still and let her hold his face, and his tail kept its slow beat. They drove back down the mountain at 3 o'clock. Elias watched the truck reach the county road junction and turn south, and then he went back inside. He read both letters that evening. The first one, the endorsement for the county commission, was formal and detailed, and Eleanor had clearly written most of it because the sentences had her particular economical structure, the facts placed in the right order without decoration. He read it twice and set it aside for the application file. The second letter was shorter. Walter had written most of it, which Elias could tell by the handwriting and by the way the sentences moved, more searching, less certain of themselves. The words of someone who had spent a long time thinking about what he wanted to say and had decided to say it plainly anyway. "You opened your door," Walter had written, "when you didn't have to. In my experience, that is the whole of it. People who open doors to strangers in a storm are rare, and most of them don't know they're rare because they think everyone else would do the same thing. They wouldn't. Most wouldn't. You should know that about yourself." Elias set the letter down on the workbench. Ranger was on his pad by the stove, already settled for the evening, his breathing long and regular. Outside, the mountain was quiet. The sky was clear the way April skies got clear at elevation. Deep, not bright. The stars coming in sharp and numerous as the light faded and the temperature dropped toward freezing again. Through the repaired east window, the tree line was still and dark and looked like nothing other than what it was. Trees, in spring, on a mountain, at the end of a long winter. Elias looked at the Motorola on the workbench, the Baofeng. The county network specs spread out in 4 sheets beside them, the repeater sites marked in pen, the coverage radii drawn in rough circles that overlapped at their edges. 40 households. Not a lot of people. Enough people. He pulled the stool to the workbench and sat down and picked up a pen and went back to work on the specifications. And the fire in the wood stove put its low orange light across the room. And outside the mountain held its silence the way mountains held everything, patiently, without judgment, for as long as it took. The strongest thing a person can do is not the moment they fight back. It's the moment they open a door they didn't have to open and decide that someone else's trouble is reason enough.